Good morning, everyone. I'm Gary Takesian. I'm a licensed Science of Mind practitioner here at Vita Spiritual Learning Center. And this morning, it is my honor to bring our weekly message. And of course, here we are in a new month, the first Sunday of July. We've now crossed that great halfway point of 2022. And I don't know about you, but for me, it seems like the first half of this year has really zipped along. And of course, here we are about a week and a half away from the summer solstice, which of course is the official start of summer, even though we kind of tend to think of Memorial Day as the beginning of summer. And that summer solstice is also the longest day of the year. So from now until the winter solstice, which happens just a few days before Christmas, we'll be undergoing that part of the year. So, as many of you know, our denomination, Centers for Spiritual Living, provides the member communities with a year-long spiritual guide, which includes our global themes, our monthly themes, and the weekly topics. And so, as we look at our beginning of 2022, we are engaged in our theme of living everyday wonder. And what I'd like to do just for a couple of minutes is just look at how we have come so far this year. And so if we take a quick look at January, we dealt with our global theme, living everyday wonder. And this is one where, even back then, I like to look at it as, changing the words around just a little bit to the wonder in everyday living. And for me, that really calls up a sense of awe, of being fully present, and of perhaps even stopping to smell the roses along the way. So that was the time we just really took a look at that time in our lives. In February, we looked at the inner life, and this was where we were reinforced with that idea that we are one with Spirit, and that Spirit is all that we are, that whole sense of oneness. In March, we talked about play, and we learned that play is a sacred activity that is healing to the mind and to the body. Who knew? Or whoever thought of it that way. I thought that was a wonderful month to look at all the ways in which we played and have fun. Now in April, we looked at creativity, and we learned that creativity is who and what we are, and that we are in this constant dance with creation itself. Now in May, we looked at emotions, and each week we looked at a different set of emotions, and we learned that overall, emotions serve as a guide for reflection, exploration, and growth. And then finally in June, we talked about our physical body and the many ways in which our body serves us, that it actually becomes an awesome conduit between us and Spirit, something to be celebrated, not shunned. And so that brings us to July. And living our everyday wonder in July will center around relationships. Relationships are the way that we relate to ourselves, one another, and the world. And with the universal power, we understand that all of those are interconnected and inseparable, relating to ourselves, one another, and the world. And our title for this week is Me, Myself, and I. And we will be looking at the relationship that we have with ourselves. All right. So when we talk about the relationship that we have with ourselves, it is the foundation upon which all other relationships are formed. Now, you may be familiar with that old saying that if we don't genuinely love and care for ourselves, how can we ever do so for others? For me, that brings to mind that biblical quote about removing the log from our own eye before we try to remove the little splinter from someone else's. So we will be looking at our relationship with ourselves in the context of self-love and how to achieve a deeper embodiment of self-love. And if everything goes according to plan, when we're done, you should be able to positively express this week's affirmation. And here it is. The universe, loving itself, is expressed in my self-love. The universe, loving itself, is expressed in my self-love. And how often have we heard in our various prayers and teachings that the universe seeks to express itself through and as each and every one of us? And I think that's exactly what's being said here. So before we go too much further, I want to stop for just a minute and talk just about love as a word, because the word love has so many shades of meaning. I can say to you, I love chocolate, which I do. I can also say, I love being at the beach. I love the ocean breeze and the waves crash on the beach. I can get all off into that. I can also say to my significant other, I love you. And then I can also say, I love life itself. But when we look at those are all slightly different shades of meaning of the word love. And when it comes to this idea of loving ourselves, that idea can sometimes feel just a little uncomfortable, because there's something about saying, I love me, that's just not in our common everyday vernacular. And I think a lot of that has to do with growing up in our Judeo-Christian culture. Whether or not we were churchgoers or we were agnostic or maybe even atheist, or we just didn't have a much of a spiritual upbringing, it's the culture that's there and it's present. And that culture emphasizes the sense that we are separated from God and that we must earn our way into God's good graces, that we should think of others before ourselves. And that somehow makes it odd to think of loving ourselves. And I know there are some Christian denominations, and I'm especially thinking about our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, that teach that we cannot possibly understand and access God directly. And so the priesthood must interpret and intercede for us in relation to God. Well, in Science of Mind, we look at that quite differently. Here's a quote from Ernest Holmes. Ernest says, all things, ourselves included, are some manifestation of spirit. Hence, all things have a direct relationship to spirit. And since spirit is all things, this relationship is direct and immediate. And I think one of the big points to understand here is this idea of direct and immediate. We need no intermediary. We don't need anyone to intercede for us between ourselves and God. That is something we understand, that as being one with Spirit, that we have that direct connection. And that is something to be really, really happy with and about, that we don't have to depend on anyone but ourselves to be connected with the divine. And while we're on this slide, just a quick aside, you may wonder why the word spirit is in brackets. And that was something that I did, because the original text from Discover a Richer Life by Ernest Holmes, Ernest included the word it there, which of course is our gender neutral pronoun. And he often uses the word it and puts it in that context when he's referring to the divine as a universal principle. And of course, we know that Ernest Holmes used many different words when referring to the divine. I mean, it could have been God, it could be first cause, it could be the divine presence. He just had a whole host of words that he used in different contexts. And so, in many ways, a lot of times we can just substitute whichever word fits for that particular phrase. And in this case, I liked the way spirit worked into that instead of the word it. So anyway, enough for that. Let us move on. And to wrap our heads around this idea of self-love and to help that out a little bit, I'd like to consider it in more objective terms. And I think there are two main components that we can look at. And those are acceptance and self-care. Self-acceptance and self-care. So what do I mean by self-acceptance? Well, acceptance itself is the process of fully accepting and embracing all of who we are, all of it, the good, the bad, the ugly, warts and all. In order to be fully committed to ourselves and to accept all of that, we have to look at all of those, that whole panorama of who and what we are, and be able to accept that fully. The other part is this idea of caring, and that means caring for ourselves, nurturing and feeding us mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And so, our work this week and ongoingly is to truly look at how we relate to ourselves. And another quote from Ernest Holmes, I think, will help us understand this, because he talks about this as a process of discovery. Ernest says, "Life waits upon our discovery of natural laws, our discovery of ourselves, and our discovery of our relationship to the great whole." And I like this idea of the relationship to our great whole. So as we consider this idea of relationship to ourselves and this great whole, I look at this, the great whole, I would prefer a different word. I would look at this as our worldview. And that means how we see ourselves in the cosmos, how we see our relationship with the divine, and how we see our relationship with the world around us. Now, if we look at this idea of the worldview as being made up of a compilation of all our life experiences, all our beliefs, thoughts, feelings, our joys and sorrows, our likes and dislikes, well, then we can begin to understand the immense influence that this has on our daily living. So I like to look at this idea of worldview as the lens through which we see and interpret our world. And this lens, just like in photography, can accommodate a variety of filters. You know, the filters you put on the end of the lens, right? And a filter, of course, is designed to let in only the type of light that the photographer desires. Well, in our case, the filters in our worldview include all of those aspects I just mentioned. We have filters for our beliefs. We have filters for our thoughts, feelings, and again, our joys and sorrows, likes and dislikes, and so many more. And they only let in the information that we allow, working often silently in the back of our awareness or completely in our subconscious. So our worldview lens focuses and filters our interactions with life. And much of the way that it influences our experiences of life is by how we see ourselves in relation to the world. Now, psychologists refer to this aspect as our self-image, who we see ourselves to be, and that is all in light of our personal history. So our self-image directly affects what is true for us as we interact with life. Another way to look at it would be to say that everything we say and do is always consistent with our self-image. So our work then is the process of delving into the deeply rooted thoughts, beliefs, and feelings that make up our self-image, and to correct the ones that no longer serve us. Now, it can help to look at our worldview and our self-image as our personal story. And our work, then, is the ongoing process of editing and updating that story. And that often requires courage and diligence. It's not often easy to examine the parts of us that we would rather leave swept under the rug. And I think Brené Brown describes this very well in this quote. She says, "I now see how owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing we will ever do." I now see how owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing that we will ever do. So how do we go about this? Well, here is where one of the essential ideas of our Science of Mind teaching comes into play. And we need look no further than our well-worn cliche, change your thinking, change your life. And added to that, the process of spiritual mind treatment, our form of affirmative prayer. Now, it helps to keep in mind that Science of Mind deals with cause and effect, and the metaphysical principle of thoughts and intentions becoming manifest in our lives. Our thoughts are cause, the results are effects. So by courageously examining of the thoughts and beliefs that no longer serve us, we can use treatment to negate an old belief and replace it with one that is more in line of who we now believe ourselves to be, in line with our updated self-image. Now, I've noticed recently that we're living in a society where subscriptions are everywhere. News media, games, software, learning courses, websites of all kinds. And so, using that kind of current way of thinking, I'd like to adapt subscriptions to our thoughts and beliefs and to think of them as mental subscriptions. And if they're just subscriptions, then can I unsubscribe whenever I decide? Well, the answer to that is yes. But that's certainly not to say that the process is necessarily easy or quick. It can take some time to work to eliminate the old calcified beliefs. And here is something that may help to put that in a perspective for us. And it's one of my favorite teachings from the teachings of Abraham, as brought forth by Esther Hicks. Here's what Abraham said. Abraham said, "A belief is nothing more than a thought you think over and over again." Now think about that for a minute, because for those of you who've been around Vita for a while, you've probably been present when I've done the I am a mountain meditation, where we are the mountain and we see our thoughts float by as the clouds. And what that meditation talks about is that we have thoughts, but our thoughts don't have us. That we can step back and the thoughts are going by, but they don't have to take us along with them. And I think what Abraham is saying here is that what we think of sometimes as this belief, these beliefs that are like almost cast in concrete, are nothing more than thoughts that we have thought over and over and over again. So if a thought can be this cloud passing by, then that means a belief can also be something that we can look at, that we don't have to accept as forever and ever, amen. That's something we can actually deal with. So the goal, of course, is now to be able to use our Science of Mind principles to bring about significant changes to our worldview and self-image, such that our true relationship with ourselves is one of authentic self-love. One more quote from Science of Mind magazine this time. Our three greatest needs are to feel that we are needed, wanted, and loved, to feel that we belong to the universe in which we live. And I would encourage us this week to delve in to what's going on with us. Find those places that stop us in life, those places where we feel that we're not good enough, that we don't deserve it, that somehow we just are not either smart enough or whatever that blockage is. And go in and realize that that's a belief that came about sometime in our life. That's a belief that you don't have to own. And we talked about how we go about doing that, using our affirmative prayer, using our spiritual mind treatment to negate that thing, to be able to say in our affirmation, that is not a part of me. I am the one in charge, and I choose differently. Because that is our choice, folks. That is what we have as a blessing through this Science of Mind teaching. So, having said all of that, let's take another look at our affirmation for the week and just see, how did we do? Have we changed any minds? The universe, loving itself, is expressed in my self-love. The universe, loving itself, is expressed in my self-love. And of course, if you've been around Science of Mind for any length of time, of course you've heard us talk about how spirit expresses uniquely and individually through each and every one of us. And I believe that's what that is trying to say, that the universe wants to express its love through our own self-love. And that is up to us to take ownership and to bring that into being. And we do that by going through and delving into all of those things that are keeping us from our good, keeping us from loving ourselves, and get to that place where we can truly accept ourselves, care for ourselves, and therefore truly love ourselves. And that is it for this morning. Peace and blessings.